Okay, so to give some context to this webinar, we're lucky enough to have Julian Stodd with us today. I guess I was really keen and curious and happy to have Julian to lead this webinar based upon some great, amazing work that I saw that he was doing inside our client base. I guess as we are providing and provoking the world to change the world towards using social learning and community engagement as a mainstream to its overall learning strategy, what I've seen inside the work that Julian and his team have done has to provide the capabilities and the skills within teams inside our client base. And I think the difference that has made has been quite profound. So for that reason, I guess I've been really excited and enthusiastic for opportunity for Julian to come in to share the experience of what he does, how he does it, and the impact it makes. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you. Let me kick this off here. Now, I've got a few slides that I'll share with you today, but Steve and I were thinking this will probably turn into something of a conversation, certainly between us, but hopefully out with you all as well. So we can all see the chat channel as we go. So if you want to avoid the two of us talking with each other for an hour, then please do throw in your questions as we go. I'm, as you know, happily distracted by anything. So I really wanted to use today to give us a chance to look at the world through a different lens. I quite often use this slide when I'm talking with groups around disruption and failure, about understanding how it is that really good organisations full of really good people fail to actually achieve those things that they set out to do. If we think that failure is something that happens to idiots, then we're sort of missing the point that failure happens to really good people who are trapped within a way of understanding the world. They're problem solving within a known space, but in fact the solutions they need exist largely in new or unknown spaces. And one of the key reasons that they struggle is that organisations are terrible at handling ambiguity. We're conditioned into understanding risk and into models of consistency and conformity, replicability at scale. That's almost a definition of what an organisation is. It's something that knows where it stands, knows what it does, knows how to do it well, and knows how to reward those people that do it effectively and often punish or penalise those people who don't. But when you actually talk within organisations about what they're looking to do, they often say we're trying to be more agile in our approach, we're trying to be more dynamic, we're trying to attract and retain the very best talent, we're trying to be innovative, but not just innovative with good ideas, we're trying to do something with those really good ideas. To do those things requires us to move beyond a known space into a substantially unknown one. It will require us to engage with people in different ways because it moves beyond the formal remit, formal currencies of the organisation. So today I want to share some thoughts with you around that. I'll start by providing a context of this work, but encourage you to think about your own organisations in this way. I sort of assume that you know how to do the job you're employed to do and your organisations know how to do those things they've always done. But this is really a time and a space to think about, what is it that we need to do, but crucially, what might we need to stop doing? How can we look at the world through quite a different lens? The context I use in my own work is to talk about the social age. And I shared this slide, which I originally drew as the front cover to the Social Leadership Handbook, to differentiate substantially between the knowledge, digital and social age. So, if we think about knowledge for a start, we come from an age where knowledge was codified. There were well-established mechanisms for finding people who know things, for establishing the truth of things, and then collapsing that down into books, into courses held in universities. We come from an age of the codification of knowledge and the centralization of knowledge, and to have knowledge was to have power. Of course, if you look at today's socially connected world, it's not just providing backdoor access to existing knowledge, it's creating new types of knowledge in new types of ways. Now, one narrative around that is that it's creating weak types of knowledge and fake types of news. And, for sure, there is some of that. Some of the new knowledge that's coming out is poorly thought through, is unvalidated, is biased. Although, if we're honest, much of the old type of knowledge was like that as well. But crucially, the mechanisms by which knowledge is created today are in themselves dynamic and adaptive. So the research into Wikipedia, for example, versus a magazine like Nature, which represents the kind of best of peer-reviewed scientific methodologies, shows that Wikipedia can become very accurate over time because of the levels of contribution that go into it. So for sure, some new things are pretty bad, but they can learn to be good. Some old things are kind of okay, but they rarely learn to be better. So one feature of the social age is this evolved nature of knowledge. Now, in organizational contexts, this is often seen as sort of crowdsourcing brilliance from within the organization. How can we be more innovative? How can we be agile by tying into the individual agency of the person? And the lens that we look at that through is how do we create the ability to do that? How can we mine this data? How can we mine this excellence from within the organization? But it's worth remembering that engagement isn't just a sort of pile of gold sat on the floor waiting for us to pick it up. It's something that we have to earn. It's something that we earn by finding the right kind of currencies, the right kind of space, the right kind of opportunities to look within. I've carried out over the last few years a very large-scale global research project looking at trust. It's called the Landscape of Trust. In fact, it's the largest research project in the world looking at the nature of trust in organizations. And two figures that came out of that were particularly interesting for me anyway. The first was that in a globally differentiated population, so through the UK, Europe, North America, South America, China, we saw 54% of people said they showed low or no trust in the organization that they work for. So they still turn up. They're people like you and me that smile, do a good job, but they don't necessarily fully trust the organization that they work for. If you ask what the consequence of that is, they say, I'm less likely to share things. I'm less likely to reach out to help other people succeed. I'm less likely to be generous with my time or knowledge or resources. So this takes us to think about the digital age. You know, the digital age is not only upon us, it's possibly substantially past us, in as much as we've already seen two key transformative effects of technology. The first that we've seen is radical connectivity. So historically, we were connected to a fairly limited number of people, typically through formal infrastructure and formal channels. But today, we're connected to many different people in many different ways, almost all of which are beyond the oversight or control of any organization or indeed government or law enforcement agency. People are connected and have conversations that carry between those different spaces. So we have knowledge being curated and created in different ways and carried by digital technologies between people. And I've been doing research around this recently, originally 2 years ago in special forces communities in America, asking them where they went to solve their intractable engineering problems. And the number one place they went was WhatsApp. And the reason they did that was because they could bring together a community of people that they trust. They could curate the problem at hand with videos, with photos, with dialogue, with video, and they could solve it. And they described their typical time to resolving a problem was under 4 hours. When I've repeated that research in the National Health Service in the UK, with over 500 respondents in the first wave of that research, of those 500, I asked them about the technologies they use to be effective on a daily basis. So it's quite sort of specific. Effectiveness, which is a good proxy for learning, and on a daily basis. That group identified 17 different technologies that they use on a daily basis to collaborate to be effective, 16 of which are not owned by the NHS. So 16 of which they're explicitly forbidden from sharing patient data. So why do they use those technologies? Well, often because they trust them more. They believe they own the conversations within social technologies in a way that they don't own it within formal technologies. They can control the consequence which is applied to them. Indeed, people say that they trust social technologies about 30% more than they trust formal technologies, a technology which is given to them by the organization itself. So that really is part of what takes us from the digital to the social age. The digital age, I say, radical connectivity and radical democratization, the democratization of capability. Things that you used to have to be within an organization to do, you can now do anywhere. You can connect into different networks, different capabilities outside the organization with ease. The social age is about how we are connected. And in that sense, I think it's the defining pressure on our organizations today, our organizations are effectively models of industrial era engineering. They're mechanisms that bring people together to achieve effect at scale through that consistency, conformity, replicability, scale, codified knowledge and control of that knowledge and formal infrastructure. But in the social age, we are often effective despite the organization around us. We're connected in many, many different ways. In that National Health Service group that I surveyed, they estimated that they are engaged in at least 15 different purposeful communities. When I asked them what the most important factor was that led to their success in one of those communities, they said something quite interesting. The single most important factor was the choreography of welcome and engagement they felt when they joined. We are at heart social creatures, so the ways we can manage the social structure of the organization is likely to be differentiating. So here we are, possibly emerging from the digital age. We're going to be given ever more fantastic technologies, but effectiveness will come from engaging within the social structure. So I thought I'd share this slide because it represents one of the many ways, I should say, where my own thinking has been wrong and sort of evolved over the last few years. So I used to share this and say there were two aspects of the organization, the formal structure, which is everything that you can see and own and control, and the social structure, which is the community that exists around it. So your laptop, your buildings, your company car, your employment contract, the organizational structure, they're all part of the formal organization. You can change them as you like. I used to say that social structure flows through and around the formal structure, but then I realized that was substantially wrong. What it does is it flows into the formal structure and it nests there. And it's that mechanism of nesting that I became interested in, because if you look at how organizations are effective or how they change, they often focus on how they change the formal structure. And you can do that. You know, you can hire people, you can fire people, you can change what they do, create new project teams. But for some reason, organizations are quite inherently resistant of that change. Lots of good people kind of nodding and smiling and supporting you, but they don't actually change very effectively. So to understand the organization today, an organization in the context of the social age, is to understand these two things. What is the formal structure and what is the social structure? How are they the same and how do they differ? And how are they connected? Well, some of the obvious aspects are that the formal structure you can scale forever. You can bring an organization to 500 people, 50,000 people, 200,000 people. You just build more assets, buy more assets, build more infrastructure, put more people in charge, build out the hierarchy. But the social structure doesn't seem to scale in the same way. It collapses into these tightly defined tribal units. And it was only 2 or 3 years ago I started using that word to differentiate between the individual and community. There's a layer in the middle, which is the tribal engagement, people who we trust. So organizations seem to be full of multiple different tribes, often engaged around common interests, but very often held in opposition to other parts of the organization. It's safe to say that you join a tribe within an organization. You don't necessarily join the organization itself. So the social structure can scale, but it doesn't scale as one thing, it scales as multiple things. And much of the strength of the social structure is held in opposition to other areas. The kinds of power that holds it together are substantially oppositional. If we sort of relate some of this back to learning, the modern learning organization, what does this kind of look like? Well, you know, the reality of learning today is quite fundamentally different from how it would have been 5, 10, certainly 20 years ago. Maybe not at a neurocognitive level, but at a fundamentally practical level. What are people doing in your organization today? And just consider kind of 4 aspects of this. The first is a rapid iteration of approach. Many organizations that I'm working with talk about sort of skills for digital learning as if this is something they have to give people. But in fact, we're all very capable of learning how to do things. And that learning comes from our communities. People figuring out new apps, new knowledge, new ways of doing things and sharing it, but crucially not settling on one way of doing it. We are individually and collectively rapidly iterating the ways we do this. Alongside that is a rapid diversification of technologies. We're moving away from core infrastructure systems to diverse ecosystems of technology, which mirrors that radical connectivity and the democratization of technology. So your ability to be effective may be less about your mastery of one particular technology, more about your ability to stitch together different technologies to suit the purpose at hand, and certainly to carry conversations between technologies. Now, already you can see a sort of core tension against organizations, because organizations are typically good at doing one thing and codifying it, buying one technology and keeping it forever. And people's careers are often sort of linked into what they've done with that technology. So that speaks to something of the fragmentation of power. Certainly a core feature of the social age is that power is fragmenting widely. And if you want to be a bit nerdy about it, you can look at what are called gradients of power. So a gradient of power is your manager to you. You know, they have formal power, and hence they can apply certain types of consequence onto you. They can fire you, they can tell you to do something, they probably have a say in how much you get for a pay rise every year. But in the context of the social age, that type of power is often challenged by social reputation or by social movements of change. We see that the base where people hold their power is shifting quite rapidly. So a modern organization will still operate within a structure of power that's formal and hierarchical, but to be effective, it will need new skills for leaders. What will they be? Well, story listening, you know, an ability to hear wisdom wherever it is within the organization, and a humility to listen to those people. When we're using technologies like Fuse, they give radical access to expertise throughout the organization. But just by putting the tap in place doesn't mean that the water will flow. It's like I said earlier, it's not a sort of pile of gold sat on the floor. You have to earn the right to hear it. And that will require us to evolve models of instructional design. It will involve us having to change models of learning and leadership for our formal leaders, and to recognize the community-based authority which comes out within those learning tribes. It will fundamentally require us to do something I was writing about this morning, which is to recognize multiple currencies. We're probably moving from a model of the single currency of the organization in a very meaningful way to a multi-currency organization. So, you know, the old domain-based organization operated on a model, a triangle really, of utility, time, and money. If you bring your utility and give me your time, I will give you money. But you can't create a socially dynamic organization within that triangle. You need to work on the parallel pillars. If you bring your invested engagement, your community-held knowledge, your tribal structure, if you bring your individual expertise, if you bring your trust, I'm going to have to pay you with something else. In fact, when we surveyed on this in multiple groups, the averages came out that if the work that people do directly leads to financial gain for the organization, 54% of them want more money as a result. If I do something for you that directly causes you to make money, I want some money. However, if what I do, if the way I engage within this community on this technology helps people, if it makes the community better, the crucial word they used was if it improves the culture, only 7% of people want more money. 54% of people wanted something else. And the thing they wanted was freedom. And they didn't just want freedom to go to Starbucks. They wanted freedom to do a whole range of things. The top 3 things that they said they would do with that freedom is, firstly, help other people be successful. Secondly, they would share. And thirdly, they would experiment. And so this really is at the heart of the tension we feel within our organization, this dynamic tension between formal and social structures. Organizations want to change, but often try to do change to people. We as individuals want to be engaged, but often lack the freedom and opportunity to be engaged in ways which are fair to us, which have meaning for us. Now, let me sort of pause there, because Steve's been silent for the longest period I've ever known him to be silent.
Which means I need to scream. That was amazing and beautiful, I think, in terms of how you illustrated that so eloquently. I wish I had the same language. So I think that's a great positioning piece. If anybody wants to jump in and ask any questions before we maybe ask Julian to kick off on the next piece. But I guess my question to Julian now is, I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. I don't have any disagreements with that at all, which is amazing and also unusual. I think so. Now the question is, I guess you're now walking into many clients and many organizations, and they're asking, okay, so we buy this, we get this, but how? How do we move from the concepts we both believe in to actually the practicalities of working in the company now that's either a centralized or decentralized team, and how do I start to make that change? And even in the client, for those that are on the webinar here, that have used clients and saying, look, we've got the technology now, where do we start and what do we do? And how do you help us?
Well, that's the kind of $1 million question. And I guess the key things I would say is this: the first thing that we need to think about is strategy. So, what is our view of how we will achieve this? It's not to have a map to the future. It's to have a blank piece of paper where you will sketch your map. And it's unlikely to be something we do individually. It's something that we need to share. That's why in my own work, I follow a mechanism of working out loud. All of my work is sketched, not because I've got a graphic designer that thinks it looks cool, but because it is a sketch. I've been somewhat struck, if I'm honest, somewhat disappointed and embarrassed by how much of my own work has proved to be wrong over the last few years. But the greatest gift I have is an almost unlimited freedom to be wrong. And that's something which is not shared by people who lead in organizations. In fact, I really, until quite recently, sort of labored under this false belief, not only that Santa existed, but that people knew more when they got to the top. And of course, it turns out we don't. We work our way up the organization, carrying the same sort of self-doubt and uncertainty as we do when we're at the bottom. The key difference being, when we're at the top, we have to sound certain, and we have to make decisions which have long-term impacts that we can't roll back. So I guess the first thing is find your blank piece of paper, find your tribe and community which is safe, which you trust, in which you can draw your sketch map and rapidly scribble out the bits which are wrong. The second thing that we need to do is to consider specific capabilities within teams, for ourselves individually and within teams. And that's likely to involve looking at a capability map for an organization. And I would do it with sort of three things in mind. The first is, what do we do already that we should continue to do? Because much of what we do at the moment is what keeps the organization safe. For sure, you should make sure you do it as well as you possibly can do it, but you should certainly continue to do it. The second thing is harder, which is, what should we stop doing? I've never yet worked in a single organization anywhere in the world that puts as much effort into deconstructing system, process, methodology, and dogma as it does to creating new. We collapse down into the organization being an entity that just accretes and asserts control. And we need to find ways to memorialize and leave some of those things behind. And the third thing is working out what new roles and skills will we need. For me, it's likely to fall into leadership behaviors, both for individual senior leaders, but also in the context of social leadership for everyone in the organization. As you move from that formal to social structure, we need to think not just about those heard voices, the permitted voices, the ones that we can hear in formal channels, but into unheard voices. What's the wisdom that we need to hear, but not necessarily can't hear, but actively stop ourselves from hearing. We actively silence it. And a reason for that is because we exist under two types of consequence. One is formal consequence. So, you break the rule of the organization, you'll be punished accordingly, or you break a law, you will be punished accordingly if you get caught. But the second is social consequence. So formal consequence applies in the formal space, and generally we're pretty good at staying broadly within it or not being caught if we sort of skim around the edges of it. But social consequence is that which is applied by the people around us. And if you ask people, which of those things is the greatest limiter of individual behavior, they say about 70% of the limitation on my own behavior is social consequence. We don't do things because we think others will judge us, is a stronger effect than not doing things because we will break a particular rule. Now, what does that mean in practice? Is that as we try to change, people may get it. You may be surrounded by good people who think like you do, who want to drive change, but they'll be slightly hesitant of actually going out there and actually experimenting and actually trying to do the things that need to be done. Now, I just wanted to share this. I've just published the latest in a series of free social age guidebooks, which are kind of under 10,000 words, very practical and applied. And the community builder one is where I try to bring in some of the research from the conditions of community work and look at specific skills. So, community building skills is likely to be something that we need. We need it for our formal leaders to understand how they will engage and how they will nurture and support and empower those communities. And we need it for individuals to understand how will we navigate the gradients of power, how will we navigate social consequence, how will we build our reputation. Because when I said earlier, we're moving from the single currency to the multi-currency organization, we're moving away from operating just with the currency of money into an organization that trades in reputation, that trades in pride, that trades perhaps in trust. And if you say, what are all those other currencies? The simple answer is, I don't know. I know some of them. I know what mine might be, but I certainly don't know what yours are. And this speaks to the unknowably complex nature of the social structure. It's subjective, it's personal, and it's complicated. It's a bit like love. You can't write a book on it, but you can describe what you feel. When I ask people to describe what trust means to them, I can tell you two things. The first is that people can easily describe what trust means to them. And the second thing is that they all describe something entirely different. Some people say, trust is like love. We just sort of hung out together, and suddenly we discovered that trust had blossomed between us. Some people describe it in reasonably transactional terms. I invested a little bit of trust in this person and they invested a bit in me, so I invested a bit more in them and they invested a bit more than me, and we gradually built it up a step at a time. People generally describe trust growing slowly over time and fracturing fast, and they generally describe a high cost and consequence of losing trust.
So just to come into it, so I guess just keying on to the previous part. So for, I guess, organizations that you've highlighted in the past that there are some companies which are ready, for the world that you talk about, right? So they've already got the cultural bit almost there. I mean, no one's perfect, but you imagine some organizations you can pick out, maybe like a Tesla, where there's so much evangelism and people are joining it, staff are joining it because they believe in its mission. So you've got those type of companies where culturally you probably think it's ripe, and there's a certain approach you would take and advise inside there, versus some which maybe have some to work in their culture. So maybe talk to the first one first upon how you'd help maybe a few client that thinks, I'm in a executive type place, we've got plenty of clients that already had success. How do you help those? And then maybe we'll come to the second question that says, okay, those that maybe need to work on the culture bit first.
Yeah, so if you see, I've been talking so much, I've lost track of where my slides are, so I wasn't quite sure where that's going to take me, but here it is. I'll talk about this slide now too, which kind of is to your point, I guess. The reason culture is interesting is that it's experienced on different levels. Again, this is a piece of work that is, I would describe as incomplete, but I feel it gives enough insight to be useful. And it really addresses the question that when you join an organization, what is it that you actually join? And people describe quite clearly that they join two different things. The first thing is they walk into an office, they see who's around them, or they join online, but they start interacting with some people. And they quickly figure out who smiles at them, who's nice to them, who tells them where the toilets are or where the good coffee is. And on day two, the same people smile at them, or they see some familiar faces. So effectively, we join a tribe. People describe that they join this entity in minutes, into days. They describe quite clearly the little rituals of engagement, the way people share food, the way people make jokes and they learn the in-jokes. They typically describe how trust forms. So one type of membership we have is a primary cultural alignment. So if I join a large global organization, I join it at a local tribal level. The second type of cultural engagement I have is secondary. And It's harder to describe, but people typically say it's complex, it's experiential, it takes them 18 months to 3 years to form. And the best way I can describe it is like this. If you've been in your organization for a number of years and I joined, I could say to you, can you please describe to me every relationship you have, every bit of knowledge you have, every way you are able to be effective? And you could do your best to describe it to me, but I would still be utterly unable to be effective. You could say, well, John over there has 2 children and he really likes the Grand Prix. And if you talk to him on Mondays, he'll be really fraught because he's had the children all weekend. I would be utterly unable to go over to John and have a meaningful conversation because I don't have the backdrop, I don't have the trust, I don't have the relationship. Secondary cultural alignment is something that we earn over time, and most people probably never find it. So without it, we're stuck at that local level. And that's probably where most of our organizations are today. The technology starts to give us access, starts to give us a common space where these different tribes can come together. But people don't have this secondary cultural alignment to be effective within it. So we're bringing together strangers in a strange space. And we get the behaviors that we exhibit in strange spaces. We are more reticent, not just more reticent to share things, we're more reticent to like the things other people have shared. We're more reticent to share opinions. We're more reticent to share our uncertainty or our willingness to be wrong. So what can we do about this? Well, it's probably a case of focusing on building the social capability. In my own work, I talk about building a more socially dynamic organization, one which focuses on interconnectivity. So if you consider there are all these primary cultures dotted around throughout the organization, we need to find ways to connect between them. And that's not going to be something that we can drive from the top. It's going to be something we'll have to create opportunities in order to do. To build the social aspect of the organization will require us to build individual capability, but not just pushing knowledge and a message through the organization. It will require more senior leaders and managers to learn the skills to hold spaces open, to hear dissenting voices, to curate the stories that come out of them, and to help build social movements of change. For more junior individuals, it's going to be to understand that there's more to engagement than saying something. Some of the other features we need to look at are the dynamics that sit underneath healthy social structures. This is about empathy. This is about resource management. This is the role of the social storyteller, the role of the community leader and community manager, and trying to bring together those different things. So there is capability development that can be done, but we probably need to start at those 2 levels. The first at the level of leadership, second at the level of almost every individual joining the organization.
And maybe get into that specific. So I guess for the clients of ours and the customers you're working with, and inside our client base especially, what's an engagement look like? So let's say that they understand exactly what's on offer here. They buy conceptually what you're saying. So and now they want to transform the organization and their teams to be the enablers of that change. So what does that engagement look like, and how do you help them transform?
So in the practical level, we tend to do 3 things. The first is working with those leadership groups to set strategy, to map out their own journey. And sometimes that's within one organization, and actually sometimes bringing together people from different organizations to give them those different perspectives. Because one thing I am confident about is that almost every organization is facing the challenge of the social age. And one of the jokes we have internally is that there's a reason why people bring us in. It's not because we're the best option, it's because we're the least worst option. So, in a new world, the old answers may stop working. So if you can bring a humility to your work, which says I may not have all the answers, but I'm willing to learn alongside others, then maybe you can make some progress. So at that top level sort of strategic view is helping our clients take a view of how they will build out the second part of the organization, how they will build a more socially dynamic organization, hence how they will transform. At the second level, You're looking at actually building capability in teams. And for the last 18 months or so, my real focus has been on building out a series of certification frameworks, which are based around three things. The first is bringing knowledge. So we're evidence-based. We're evidence-based practitioners. So carrying out the research and bringing in the knowledge of how things really work. How do people really learn? How do communities really form? How does trust really work? What does social leadership really look like? How is innovation fostered and amplified at scale? And then you need techniques, you know, getting right down to the level of saying it's Tuesday morning, it's 10 o'clock, what are you actually going to do about it? So we build our certifications around that, around knowledge, around techniques. But crucially, the third aspect is experiments. So if I give you an example, again, I've lost track of where I am in my slides, so forgive me for jumping ahead. I'll just show you on one of these. For example, the landscape of stories, the storytelling certification. What we do with that is it's 12 weeks, but 6 weeks of that is where people take that knowledge, take those ideas and run an experiment in their own organization. And they have to start by thinking, what is my everyday reality? What is the context? What is the thing I want to find out? How will I prove or disprove that? But the interesting thing is that some of these experiments fail. And I don't think they fail because of the brilliance of the individuals doing them. They fail because the culture of the organization cannot stand the true ambiguity of an experiment. In fact, one of the cohorts I've had going through has been carrying out their experiments on views. So they've been looking at what are the conditions for sharing? Why do people share? If they're not using a platform, where else are they sharing? And why are they making those differentiated decisions? Certainly in one organization that I've got a cohort running through, none of the participants have managed to finish their experiments because they've all encountered really good people telling them that they can't experiment, stopping them from bringing in the ambiguity, the uncertainty of so doing. It probably speaks to, again, forgive me jotting around in my slide deck here, I do this a lot. It speaks to the other thing I was writing about this morning, which is the organization as a system of belief. One way to look at an organization is just as a collection of stories. And so to understand the organization, you have to understand how stories work and how they are often fired against each other. When people participate in social collaborative spaces, they can fire their own stories out, but they're also at the whim and mercy of people who fire stories back at them. And one of the things that's become sort of very clear to me is that there is a certain violence in stories. Stories are not neutral. They can really disempower and disenfranchise us. And we see these narratives battling out. So again, to generate engagement on social collaborative technologies, we have to understand how stories work, but also how the power flows behind those stories so that we can hold each other safe as we do so.
And Julie, what lessons do you think we can take from, I guess, marketing and social media in general, and apply them to the world of learning and learning design?
Well, when I talk about sort of the social age and socially dynamic organisation, I'm certainly looking sort of way beyond social media themselves. I think you could build a socially dynamic organisation with no technology and certainly without Twitter. But the thing that we can most visibly see is the way that power falls to people with compelling stories is one thing, and secondly, the importance of authenticity. So in my own work on social leadership, at the heart of that, I describe social leadership as the roots that you put out. It is engagement in your community, investment in your community, without any expectation of reciprocity in the moment. You invest in others, not because you think they will invest in you, but because that puts down your roots. And that's what gives power. People are super clear what they look for. In one of the global technology companies that has adopted that social leadership work globally, so something like 70,000 people, we surveyed in that organization what is the number one thing they look for in leadership. And they identified 69 different traits and ranked them all in order of importance. things. And the thing that came out number one was authentic storytelling. Within another organization, which is in fact a Fuse client which has fantastic engagement, we carried out some very in-depth research, which is prototype. So I've done this with 3 organizations. I wouldn't say it's fully calibrated yet. So I sometimes describe some of my work as 1% work, which means it's sort of 99% likely to be somewhat wrong, but it's creeping its way there. And it came up with a result which really surprised me. So we were asking how people respond to those stories which are told by senior executives and pushed down the organization. And I thought that people would not enjoy those stories. The execs standing in front of head office with the flags waving in the background and the suit and tie. I thought that they will respond badly to these stories. And they said they loved them, which just sort of gave me that moment of humility to realize that my cynicism is my own and not that of everybody else. But they did say something super interesting. They said, we really love hearing those stories, but our greatest frustration is we have no space to respond. And that to me spoke of the evolving gradient of power. I'm perfectly happy for the person at the top to tell me their story, as long as they're willing to listen to my story. I came across this again when I was doing work with Boeing over in the US on innovation. I had a group of 150 of their leaders over quite a long program looking at unlocking innovation. How do they unlock the innovation of their youth, bring it back into the organization today? And they said what they wanted was time. When we gave them time, they then revisited that and said what we actually need is capability. They recognized that their ability to come together in a community to be effective, to innovate, was a specific skill set they needed to build. But when I asked them the reward they wanted for that, they said we would like access to seniority. And that's quite a common theme. People, if they are engaged socially in the organization, they often want access to seniority to build their network and connection. But that's when I made a mistake. I managed to arrange for them to have, the people who were most engaged, I arranged for them to have lunch with the chief executive. And I said to them, what do you want the chief executive to talk about? And of course, they turned around to me and said, we don't want them to talk at all. We want them to listen. And that's hard. When I worked with a group with the Institute of Directors in the UK, I remember clearly having the HR director from one of the big law firms in there. And she said to me that something which typified this attitude. She started the session. I should have realized that it was going to be an issue because the session was called The Trouble with Millennials. And she said, the real issue is I've got young people coming into the organization today who want everything now. She says, it took me 30 years to get where I am in this organization. And I said to her, of course, it won't take them 30 years to get there. It took her that long because she had to work within formal structures and gradients of power that were handed out by the organization. But increasingly, the authority that we get will be claimed within our communities. Today, if your organization is trying to recruit people, and if it is looking for brilliance and innovation and engagement, it's not really just employing one person. It's employing one person plus their network and connections and goodwill. If you want their utility, you can pay them for it. But if you want that invested engagement, the invested engagement of the multi-currency organization, the engagement which will get them to participate in the visible social collaborative technologies that will create these new types of knowledge, then we have to earn it.
And I guess a loaded question really, but I guess I've seen inside our organizations where there's been authentic leadership sharing their stories out in a really early way. Is that giving permission to other people to do that? So I guess for a lot of people, it's quite, I mean, there's two things there, isn't there? It's quite a scary concept to put yourself out there to begin with. And then the capability to do that in an interesting, engaging way as well. So I don't know how you think about both of those parts.
The way I sort of think about it is this. I strongly suspect that most of our most successful organizations today are highly successful almost despite everything they do to try to be successful. I think they invest a great deal of effort and energy in programs and interventions which they believe give them success. But the reason they're successful is that they've employed some really good people who are often effective despite the system. The first thing that we need to consider when looking at how we sort of unlock this puzzle is to stop looking outwards and to look inwards. You know, the humility of the individual leader at whatever level they are in the organisation. It's to think, what voice can I hear today that I can't hear elsewhere? I do some quite interesting work with graffiti artists and the notion of cultural graffiti within organisations. And the idea is that if you, and you know, talking here in Shoreditch today is interesting because Shoreditch is an area which has sort of sanctioned cultural graffiti. It's kind of okay to spray graffiti here, but generally graffiti is not okay, and it's sprayed on the back door of the shop, or it's sprayed in the alleyways. Nobody sprays it in plain sight because then they will be persecuted for it. Organisations have to learn and read that cultural graffiti. I did an exercise with the National Health Service in Scotland at the end of last year, beginning of this year. Again, apologies for sort of being a bit nerdy about it, using a technique called critical discourse analysis to analyse the graffiti people used to describe leadership and their experiences of leadership. So I got them to tag these giant 60-foot blackboards with an image and a tag. A tag is a territorial piece of graffiti. I got them to create and spray their tag of what leadership means. And then we carried out an analysis of all the words and imagery that was used. And it was all fairly predictable. They talked about compassionate leadership and generosity and safe spaces. And their imagery was rockets heading up, stars, flowers, images of growth. But then what we did in the subsequent activity was get them to graffiti and deface those things which other people had written. And then carried out an analysis of all the words and imagery that was used to deface it. And the number one term they used to describe leadership then was selfish. They talked about closed communities. They talked about old boys networks. They talked about privilege and power. And I suspect what they were describing in those two experiences was firstly the leadership they want and that they feel within their local trusted tribe. And secondly is the leadership they experience in that wider global organisation.
Just want to come in with a question from Rosie. I don't know if you can see it here, but so Rosie's question is that she works within a formal public school for high school teachers and thinks they're maybe a bit stiff, and was wondering how do you help transform those relationships to build trust.
So the sort of simplest answer is that we have to start with being able to share a story. So to share our uncertainty is one of the terms I often talk about with leaders at quite senior levels. You know, where can you share your uncertainty? Now to do that is to introduce a vulnerability, but social systems operate on vulnerability. You know, there's a reason why it's to your closest friends and confidants that you share your uncertainty. To do so in an organisational context is difficult, but start by doing that. You know, start by sharing a story. You can do that in different ways. You know, it can be through a blog, it can be on a platform, it can be in small groups. One interesting approach, which I quite liked, is where people can do it with a poster. So they create a poster which can be shared in a canteen or in a team space, which says, this is a doubt that I have. Please share your doubts or please share your uncertainties. So it's kind of very public, but it can generate some kind of foundation for further conversation.
I'm just aware that we're coming up to maybe 10 minutes left. I've got a bunch of questions to ask, but if other people want to come in and ask a few questions of Julian and myself, now's a great time to put the questions in before I finish off with all my questions. I get them all to myself. So your chance here. In the meantime, let me just ask you one question while people think about that. So you were just framing beforehand the ways that you engage with an organisation. So whether there be, you know, a small organisation or large, which was around the strategy piece, the building capability piece, and then solutions at scale. So maybe just talk a little bit more of that in terms of specifics would be great.
So yeah, we look at that level, you know, as an organisation is trying to change, creating what we'd call a navigation space, which is typically a small number of people who have a responsibility for the future state of the organisation, creating that shared safe space and helping them form their journey over time, helping them draw their map. At the moment, my main focus in building capability in teams is looking at certifications. I've got certifications running around storytelling. The new one, which is just launching next month, is about community building. And then we're prototyping the one I'm most excited about, really, which is the Modern Learning Capability Program, which looks at the core skills and capabilities of learning and development teams in driving change. But we'll continue to build these out. The point really is they are all evidence-based, they're research-based, but they're grounded in techniques and practically what you do about it at scale. But the third part, of course, solutions at scale is how will you engineer this into your induction and onboarding programs? How do you engineer it into your leadership development? How do you engineer it into the everyday of the organization? And the reason for that is some language which I started using last year, which is about understanding dominant narratives. And a dominant narrative is our way of understanding how the world is. And I'll give you an example of a dominant narrative. The role of women in society is gauged by a dominant narrative, which, as we've seen through multiple examples over the last couple of years, is being assailed by new claimed types of power, often aggregated in social spaces, challenging not only established modes of power, but challenging established models of social organization. And it's fascinating to see, firstly, how that power is being claimed, and how, in fact, just last week, I think, on the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, which I've written about widely in terms of understanding social movements of change, to understand not only how people find and claim power within this new space, but seeing the typical and often violent, if not physically, then violent in terms of stories, ways that those stories continue to be oppressed. And I could say you look at that in data on the gender pay gap today in organisations. In the UK, organisations over certain size have to publish their gender pay data, but none of them yet are taking the action that they should take to equalise that. None of them are fixing the problem today. And it's that inauthenticity of action which has significant impacts on how much people trust the organisation they work for.
Just something you touched on really quickly, something else you touched on before. How do you see I guess the knowledge capabilities you're putting in place in the roles of teaching learning professionals? Because I guess traditionally, right, we had instructional design, and actually the funny thing, obviously, about the first generation of instructional design was social was omitted from the actual design, right? So especially when we had, I guess, SCORM courses being a great standard that basically says actually you can't have a conversation with inside it because it's meant to be a place where you actually go and learn in an asylum by yourself in solitary confinement. So I guess now with social being such embedded towards it, does that mean that we need to kind of blow up the whole of instructional design?
Yeah, and you sort of speak to me at, I guess, a sort of interesting time. I mean, I've previously written a book on learning methodology, and I've just had published in the US a government publication on social learning. And I'm just myself now trying to reconcile those pieces together. So it's sort of fundamental level of pedagogy, how are we evolving our models of instructional design? I still think it holds true. The structure I put in that original book on it was, I think still holds true, that instructional design, however we tackle it, will need to cover certain key areas. It will need to establish a contract with the individual learner. Now, the nature of that contract today is going to be different because we're expecting different types of engagement, but we have to consciously establish that contract. We have to set the context for what is happening, but increasingly understand the context of the individual. The third part is demonstration. We have to give people clear parameters of what is expected. But then the key parts are exploration. And this is where social comes into its own. If you want people to do something with the knowledge you're giving them, you have to give them the rehearsal spaces and the sense-making spaces to explore what that means. So core skills of instructional design become creating those spaces and engineering the opportunities for specific behaviors within it. You then can move into reflective spaces, assessment spaces, and ongoing performance support. Those are the kind of steps that I go through. When I look at instructional design and where we take it, I personally have been working on specific co-creative behaviours that we can use as the building blocks of instructional design. So, for example, curation. How do we use curation in learning? Interpretation, challenge, sense-making, storytelling. You can look at these as specific types of behaviour and the building blocks. So an appropriate learning methodology will ensure that you build a rounded experience of learning. And having the right co-creative behaviours engineered in will ensure that you create the best possible conditions for that interaction to take place, if we also focus on those aspects of social leadership and community formation that will enable those.
Would we say certain programs would benefit more from high levels of social engagement, versus others? So I'm thinking, at one extreme, something like compliance. You may not want everyone asking questions about, did I just commit anti-bribery? Maybe versus others, which is where knowledge is evolving, and therefore, an organisation really needs the organisations to learn quick, fast, and to get that around the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I'd say about compliance is that no organisation, no matter how much compliance training it does, ends up fully compliant. So there's a reason for that, which is that really good people typically break the rules at a hyper-local level, and they cover each other's backs as they do so. I ran a session with the military in the UK last year with nearly 50 of the most senior leaders in the room, and asked them how they are effective. And one of the younger people in the room stood up, still a very senior leader. He said, I'll tell you the mechanism by which I'm effective. First is I go out and do the thing that needs to be done, and I break whatever rules I need to break to get it done, because I'm mission-led, I'm purpose-led. He said, second thing, the mechanism by which I'm effective is I'm surrounded by a team who cover my back as I do so. And as he said that, the two old guys next to me, and one turned to the other and said, well, he's brave to admit that. And so that, I think, represents the truth of many organisations. Firstly, that people are effective because they break rules and cover each other's backs as they do so. And secondly, that we're relying on them being brave, which feels like a pretty risky strategy.
With a couple of minutes left, I'm not sure if there's anyone else wants to come up with the last questions. If they don't, then I get Julian again for my last question again. Although, Julian, any final points that you want to maybe consider before you jump out?
I guess I've just put the details up there, either through your Fuse partners or just direct. I'm happy to share out any of that work. I've actually just published a couple of months ago the Social Learning Guide, which starts to address that evolved instructional design approach and looks at how we build that out. I normally would say the place to start is with yourself. Where are your opportunities to explore and experiment? Where is your community that will carry you safely forward? And at heart, I'm finishing off a book at the moment called the Change Handbook, and it says 6-week change. If you can't measure change in 6 weeks, there's probably a very good reason, which is that nothing is changing. So think about that. How can you carry the organisation forward by doing small, rapidly iterative steps of change? Both those steps you'll take yourself and supporting those around you to take their steps forward.
And a beautiful ending. So thank you so much. And as Julian said, if you want to get in contact with him directly, absolutely, on his contact details and his handles in front of you. If any of our clients want to get access to Julian or things he's doing, or talk to people that have been using him and his team, again, contact us or CSMs, and we'd love to connect you as well. But thank you, Julian. Thank you for sharing. And hopefully everyone who's attended enjoyed the benefit of his wisdom.
Thanks very much, Steve.
Thank you, guys. Cheers. Bye. Signing out.